And what I wanted to do was to open it to commentaries, so that actually you could historicize the collection based on commentaries of people that are still alive, of people that have participated in it, new judgments, and etc., young people. But that would have taken all the curatorial process away from the institution, made it public, and also taken away from the hands of the curator. And of course, in the end, the institution stepped in and closed the process. I think that, when then we look at the issue much more large, and the problem that is related to these participatory forms, and the art as institutional form, that's where lays the biggest obstacle. It's about the changing structures that are fighting as much as they can in order not to be changed, not to be shifted. That's one of the thoughts that came out.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think one of the problems, and this, so I teach at a university, and the debate still is about things like Wikipedia and should students use it or not, and is it reliable or not. And that's, to me, the wrong question. We need a new stance. It used to be that students were trained to go to the right sources, and it was a credible, authoritative source, and that's what you can use. We have to train. You can't go to Wikipedia with that same idea. That doesn't work. And yet that's the training. Students need a different kind of training, and that's about coming in as critical thinkers, as active participants, about people who need to actively discriminate. What am I reading? Is this plausible or not? How can I double check it? It's a very different stance. Same with the news world. The old stance was to accept it as the truth. Here it is, read it, it's objective. It's the facts. Well, in the new online world of news, where there's all kinds of stuff, and even the off world, our stance actually haven't yet changed the way we teach people. We haven't yet changed the way we ask people to engage in art. They're coming at it in the old direction, and yet what we're starting to see are forms that don't exactly work very well if you look at it the old way. So it takes a kind of a cultural re-education process, and hopefully we'll survive, because there's a lot of people who can also take advantage of this very quickly and are taking advantage of it. So the question is whether we survive to get to that cultural moment. But it's really about a new stance to embrace that process.
Hi, just wanted to say I really appreciated your talk. And I totally agree that there's a lot of disruption of traditional boundaries, whether it be through data or algorithms, a computational term, etc. And I do also a lot of work on how authorship is being very problematized in this whole scheme of things. But if I listen to your talk, what I really want to ask is, in which sense maybe the algorithm has become the author? I know that you kind of claim that technology is neutral, and that's kind of a big statement.
Algorithms are.
Right, and yeah, algorithms definitely aren't, and I think it's wonderful examples with the microphone. I mean, the original microphones were tested on mostly middle-aged white men, and they wouldn't capture the voices of women, and especially Asian women. This actually still happens with finger biometrics of all sorts, right? So it's a good, simple example of the thing I'm holding in my hand and how it's not neutral, and how just using it collaboratively is actually going to not be a way, I'm not going to be able to intervene in the way it authors me, right? So I'm just wondering, I'm not trying to snap back the grid and find an author, but I'm just wondering if authorship has not been now kind of passed on to the algorithm, and whoever is writing the algorithm.
Well, so I definitely think that a lot of power has been passed on to the algorithm. And yet we live as if it's us and the thing, and really there's an intervening layer. And as I said, we don't have good critical language for it. We don't even see it. You can't even get it in many cases. You can't put your hands on it, even if you could read through the ciphers. So that to me is an urgent thing to somehow fix, to make these, to make this, one of our projects is to work with grade school kids to help them understand algorithms, to give them toolkits to build them, and the more you are fluent with it, the more you can understand that it isn't just, what you said with the microphone, Coca-Cola was the same way with dark skin. Black looked green, but boy, if you were white, you looked really healthy. And but those were givens, and they were, how do you change that? With an algorithm, it's incredibly flexible if you know how to get in there and tamper with it. So it seems to me that it's about calling it out and saying, hey, there is this thing between you and me, and here's how it works. And the more we can gain some fluency in that domain, the more we can understand that, you know what, it doesn't have to be, it's A, it's there, and B, it's doing something, and C, you can do something to it. But I agree that a lot of authorship is in that, what was once authorship is now in that space.
Hi, I just wanted to add one more thought to that, and that is that in this new world, doesn't the artist have to also be a programmer, or the programmer has to be an artist? So that it's a dual capability that we have to develop, and universities have to raise artists as programmers and artists to make the most of this algorithm. Otherwise, it's the programmer and the artist, and there's a divide. A New York Times journalist who's on the field, who shots mobile video, or any journalist, has to be able to hack it. So the new artists also have to be hackers to be able to. So that was one thing that I wanted to have a comment from you maybe. And the second question is, what does your mobile experience lab look at? If you would explain that, please.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
So first, on the fluency of these techniques, like hacking, if you will, but fluency, yeah, I think it's essential. And not just for artists, I think humanists, I look at a lot of my colleagues, even at a place like MIT, and there's a fear. There's a fear that makes them actually a little bit reactionary, and they hold tighter to their books. And they don't want to look at the kind of enablements of some of these new tools that actually allow you to raise questions that you would never have thought of before, that are quite productive questions. So I think across the board there needs to be much more effort made to give us fluency in this sector. Mobile Experience Lab is a project that does quite a bit of work in Europe especially, interested in things like location-based storytelling. So they're doing a project, a lot of heritage-type projects, big project in Lucca and Firenze on heritage. Doing some work in Paris on using bus stops, trying to use by putting in different stuff in glass, we can turn it into kind of a communication center where people can message one another, get information. So that kind of basically very, very much about location and decentering interactions, and a lot of bottom-up stuff.
You tiptoed around the subject of copyright, right? And you recently, just a few minutes ago, spoke about re-education. So do you have a specific proposal about how we acknowledge authorship, we monetize, we compensate, and we address intellectual property in this new age?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had a really good answer for it, and I don't. I think, let's put it this way. I think technologically, it's basically, at least seen from an industry perspective, the days of holding very tightly to IP are over. Once you can send this stuff out as fast as the transmission, the proven transmission rates are, libraries will be gone in a flash and hard to recover. So I think there's some pressure. I think folks like Benkler have, to my mind, have done the most interesting thinking in this area, and Leslie to some extent. But they don't come up with business models for it. You know, the arts, one might say, or the state should be far more involved in supporting the arts, especially at a moment where, if we think of the old economic logics, where ownership and market value were important, that's not how the new stuff works. Some of the most interesting stuff I've seen here in Istanbul are things that you have to put in a dark room, and no corporation is going to buy it, and no one's going to, the scale is too big for a home. So these are things without market value, and yet they're really profound artistic statements. So there has to be a different kind of financing for that. And every state model I've seen doesn't work. There's always who does the selection. So I don't know what that model is. I do know that there's been some interesting, in the music scene at least, a number of interesting, anecdotes that suggest that the crowds, micropayment systems work a lot better than royalties work. That's maybe a step in the right direction. But again, because we're in this transition where it's either paid for or free, the kind of in-between zones aren't really worked out. And that's part of this, re-education sounds so Maoist, but it's, we need a new orientation, a new way to think about how we keep things going. And in a certain way, a lot of this is digging the roots out from under the old industrial capitalist economies, and yet our economic logics all work that way. No wonder that the kind of economic crises we're having, these kind of bubbles of valuation that rise and fall, algorithmically driven, I might add, in some cases. You've maybe seen on Google, on Amazon, the book prices that are in the millions. Some guys, a book on flies was, I think, up to $2 or $3 million in print, I might add, because two different bookshops that do reselling have an algorithm based on one another's. One is always like 1.27 more expensive than the other. So they just jumped it up. It got noticed when it hit like $1 million or $2 million. That kind of craziness is out there in the stock markets. So we're at a moment where fundamental rethinking about economics is in order, and that only comes about, those sort of things either evolve very slowly, but history tells us they come about because of very painful changes. And it's like musical chairs. You hope you're not the one standing when this baby collapses, but it's getting a little rocky. So I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. Maybe
I will give you an answer this afternoon on this question, and that's more radical than Roy's Lessig and Jochen. Then I will give you. So.
Hi, I really, I'm over here in the corner.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Sorry.
Yeah, I very much appreciate your exploration of the agency of the algorithm. I'm curious though about the problem of narrativity, and I don't think the examples that you've given provide us with a kind of rupture in the kind of cohesion and suture of narrative. And in fact, a lot of the work that happens with mobile storytelling, collaborative storytelling, in many ways reinforce the idea of a unified worldview. And algorithms, and you gave the example of the narrative science algorithm, in fact, work from, are structured in order to create that kind of coherence, which is very much a modernist coherence of narrative. And if one can't break narrative, and a lot of work in the 20th century was about the insistence on rupturing narrative, looking at multiple subjectivities, undermining coherence, undermining the power of the state and its coherence. Postmodernity was very much about that project. I'm not sure that there's a kind of radicality in the algorithm, and in fact the examples that you've given that allow us to think about multiplicities of view.
I agree fully with what you're saying. I tried to mix like evil examples and good examples. So this I see as a fairly, evil is the wrong word, but a pretty mundane application. This tries to maintain the status quo. You're absolutely right. This, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily. And so I come at this, so I have a games lab in Cambridge and one in Singapore. And in the games world, there are narratively driven games with pretty streamlined. But by and large, the interesting ones are more the sandbox games where I think you can think of narrative in two ways. You can think of narrative as a structure, a textual structure with a beginning, middle, and end. Or you can think of narrative as an experience, as something that give me three things and I'll tell you a story. It's something that I bring to the table. And that's kind of the position I lean towards, and I like algorithms that enable that. So something more like this example, or like this history example, where I can sort of put things around in ways that make sense to me, and might make sense to someone else, but they might route themselves in entirely different ways. And I'd like to see how they route themselves, because maybe they're telling a better story than I'm telling. But it's not about a sort of fixed, stable structure as we've known it. And I agree fully. I mean, that's why I think this is such a lame going on insidious idea. It's just trying to fire a few more writers. That's basically its task. And the low-paid sort as well. That's really tragic. Where this actually enables something quite different. And it sees narrative as a kind of environment that I can navigate through in any way that feels right to me and that makes sense to me. So yeah, I agree with that. But I think this is in a far more radical way than a lot of this is James Joyce. I think this is actually more radical than Joyce. Although he's maybe not the best example of a radical narrative, but he's out there. Okay, well, thanks very much.